Welcome everyone. We are at a new episode of Sessions. My name is Elizabeth Reiss, and I'm the director of the Arts Center of the Capital Region. And I'm very happy today to introduce everyone to Colie Collen, who is known as Flower Scout. But nice to see you today.
Nice to see you. Thank you for having me.
How long have you been doing Flower Scout?
Well, Flower Scout, I came back to Troy in 2012 after some time on a farm in Western Mass. And I had come up with the idea, or the genesis of the idea for the business there, just growing vegetables and animals on a farm in Williamstown. And we were asked to really interrogate some part of the farming business and figure out what we might like to do when we left. And so as someone who didn't want to acquire a lot of land or debt, I thought I could come back to Troy, this place I'd been living already for, I don't know, a few years, but my family's from here. And I could piece it together. I could grow in community gardens or at my parents' property or on friends' properties and really piece a flower business together. So that was about 2013, yeah.
When you say you were in Western Massachusetts and you were asked, who was asking you?
Well, it was an apprenticeship on a farm called Caretaker Farm, which is one of the first CSA farms in this country. And it was really like a program, an educational program for the 4 apprentices who were there. And so we were tasked with sort of inventing a course of study for ourselves. Some people got really interested in just like soil management. Some people got interested in volunteers and how you work with nonprofits in farming. And I got really into flowers. And there were lots of flowers to play with there. So I practiced the beginnings of arranging there just on my own, no formal training or book learning about it, just cutting flowers and playing with them. And I think that was really beneficial to me. I didn't have a lot of ideas going into it about what a good arrangement looked like.
Did you grow up on a farm?
No, I grew up in Loudonville, Manans, in a suburban space with really poor soil. My mom was always fighting to grow grass. She couldn't even grow grass there. It was just sand. My grandmother grew a lot of flowers, and my grandpa on the other side grew a ton of veggies, but it wasn't ever something that I got very involved in. What's strange is I came to flowers through farming, but I came to farming and the interest in plants and agriculture and natural spaces through reading. So I think it all is strange. I just, as a young adult, a lot of the authors I was drawn to were like Thoreau. So I thought that I was like a wilderness adventurer, basically, from reading like him and John Muir. And so then I got interested in being outside, and then I finally got outside and decided, oh, I really like that. I'll make a lifestyle out of that, from being a bookish person. And then flowers came and brought me back inside. So it's all a meandering thing.
What I find interesting about your meander is sometimes people look at any kind of art that's been made or any kind of creative act, and that line that people will say, oh, I could do that in a few minutes, or things of that nature. And I'm not sure people really understand the lifetime of thought and philosophies that go behind the decisions that you make. Anybody can copy an eye. They can look at a work and say, I can do something like it. But why you started it to begin with is yours alone. And it takes a lifetime to plan it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's really astute, actually, and that like the organism that is a particular person's work is so much more complex and attractive for so many reasons we can't quite articulate, so many nuanced reasons that have to do with everything they've ever read or what they watch or who they know or what their spirituality is, or all of these different things are part of the business. And definitely in the age of Instagram, I think people are doing a lot of copycatting, and that's great, actually, and interesting, because if the practice is a good, wholesome practice, like which I think flower arranging is, then it's just going to bring something to them and they can take it in their own direction from there.
We lose, I think about COVID and craft and making during COVID. And the more control we're losing to COVID, the more we're going to want to knit a scarf or print a greeting card or however we're going to manifest it.
Yeah.
Just to have evidence that we can build the world around us.
I listened to an interview on WAMC this morning with this woman, Sue Stewart-Smith, who is a psychoanalyst who's married to a really famous garden designer in England. And she wrote a book called The Garden in the Mind, or that might not be exactly the title, but it's about how the practice of gardening is beneficial to mental health. And she talks a lot about hands and physicality. And
yep.
I thought that was really great.
And it's funny, somebody was asking me about art and mental health. And I said that physicality, whether you're creating an art object or you're gardening. So for me, those two have always had an intrinsic tie together. So I do think that sometimes these threads run through our lives.
Yeah. And once you find, something to me that is amazing about gardening is just that it's a lifelong course of study that has no end. And that I do see myself get profoundly better, or that I get deeper into certain channels of every season. And sometimes I can get very sad about the fact that we get to do it for about half of our calendar year here. Mm-hmm. And then I spend the other half of my year just wishing I was getting better at the thing that I'm trying to spend my life doing. But there is all of this reading and thinking and, drawing and processing that can go into it too. So that's what the winter months are for.
I was curious if you think that the people who seek you out do so just because they like your design, or do you think you've got kind of philosophies in common with your customers?
I think that's a really good question, and one that I'm always interrogating as well. I think that when I started in 2013, 2014, the style that I was half inventing and half emulating was this sort of wild, farm-inspired, Dutch masters-inspired, elegant but crazy bouquet making. And so a lot of that was happening in Brooklyn. A lot of it was happening in other parts of the country. High-end wedding stuff was really inspired by that at that moment. And so I got a lot of business from people who were looking for that in this area and didn't see any other florists doing it. But now, flash forward however many years later, there's a bunch of florists who do a great job at that kind of style here. So I have begun to wonder, what reason would people have for coming to me? I think I've had feedback from friends and longtime customers just about the kind of roots of this business. And at this point in 2020, given that weddings are all canceled, everything that I'm making and have made for the past few months is entirely grown by me in Troy. So I think that makes a large difference in terms of the sustainability aspect and the personal aspect of that. I also, do a lot of sort of, lately I've been pretty busy, but historically I've done a lot of writing around my philosophy, ideas that come to me, things I read, and, I've mused a lot about this industry and flowers in general and the natural world and written a lot about it. So I think if folks have any exposure to my online presence, they might feel a kinship with that. And I think that there's customers who come to me for that reason. But I'm amazed how many people buy flowers from me regularly and grow flowers themselves. They do feel a kinship, I think. And they want to support the business and connect. And if you're buying a bouquet of flowers in a grocery store or from 1-800-Flowers, there is no way to know where those flowers are coming from, what they've been sprayed with. the conditions of the workers who are growing those flowers or packaging them. And there's been a lot of revelations. There's been a lot of writings published about how atrocious that industry actually is. And it's silly because it's a non-essential thing. You're buying something that's supposed to be a gesture of love or appreciation or congratulations, and just turning a blind eye to how it got to you. And I think that because we've started acknowledging this, a lot of people have around food. Flowers are sort of following a decade in the wake of that movement. People are beginning to pay attention to it more and more. Also, a lot of farmers are turning to growing flowers because it can be a crop that makes good money if it has a good return if you're a larger farmer.
Does it have less risk than vegetables insofar as pestilence? Or
it's hard for me to say. There's definitely pests that will come after your flowers. I don't deal with any, I could practice completely organically, but I also just haven't dealt with too many pests personally, groundhogs and things like that. But growing in the city, I don't have deer, and I don't grow like wide swaths of one thing that might all be decimated at once. So,
Colie, you said something earlier that interested me that I'm sure people realize, but the flower industry is directly impacted by the event industry, and events right now are canceled across the world. What's COVID done to you?
Well, all of the weddings that I was set up to do this year have been canceled, beginning in April. With just a trickle of cancellations, and then eventually everyone succumbed, up to October. I have a few small things where I'm making someone a bridal bouquet for a small elopement or ceremony, and financially, that's really tricky. I mean, that's where all of my income comes from. I would say 90% confidently. So it's a lean year for sure. What's interesting for me is that I was sort of working on a slow pivot toward garden design and landscape design for residential clients. And so I was able to start doing a little bit of that early on this year because I wanted to anyway. I was always going to. And now that feels like a really wise pivot. So that's something that I'm going to lean into a little bit more. And I've been working on a horticulture design certificate with the Berkshire Botanical Garden. So I'm feeling really excited about that direction. And I've also been making bouquets for delivery much more than I ever did before. So people are placing orders, and it might be a congratulations that they can't deliver in person. I've delivered bouquets, contact lists for people who have been diagnosed with COVID. And I was doing deliveries in the early spring, before like the world lit up with flowers outside, when we were all trapped in and it was still really winter. I did a lot of Sunday deliveries for people, folks sending each other little greetings. So that's felt really good, honestly.
So I imagine that to get a beautiful bouquet of flowers can lift anybody up, and I think that your work would really be a unique and beautiful gesture. I hope that part continues. But do you think weddings will come back? Do you want to go back to it if you can pick up this garden design? Is that a world you want to get back to?
Yeah, it's true. And so I think that that's a really great question also, because we're all wondering when large gatherings will be able to resume. And we don't have an answer for that question at all. Some folks have gone forward with weddings, certainly in this time, but I don't think it's very wise. I wouldn't do it personally.
Yeah.
And I am interested in a shift in the industry. Certainly it's difficult for those of us who've built businesses around it to imagine how we'll reformulate those businesses and make money in the future. But I do think that the wedding industry, the wedding industrial complex, as people say, has gotten a little out of control. And that people are performing weddings in this way that I don't think is, it doesn't add to their own enjoyment of their wedding. It's nice to have a beautiful wedding. And certainly I think flowers are really important for celebrations of all kinds. But But you know, when the average American wedding is at $35,000, which it was a few years ago, I think something is misaligned. And I think that it would be good if we started to think about it a little bit more.
I do.
Whereas I would say garden design for me, at least now as I'm just putting my toes in, feels like bringing people into better connection with the place in which they live and bringing people outside more and helping them notice things more. And that to me, I could get down with 100%, you know? So it feels promising, but I'm still figuring out how the business part of it works.
What is your sort of base suggestion or your base recommendation for a new gardener? What would you want to impart to someone?
You're right to touch on the idea that people might be scared of gardening. I encounter that even when I sell someone a houseplant. And I think it's important to consider it more of an investigation or an experiment where there will be wins and necessarily losses. So you'll kill a lot of plants. I still kill a lot of plants. And I absolutely beat myself up about it, but it's just part of the process. And so I think in becoming a new gardener, a curiosity is the most important thing to begin with. You know, I'm going to try and put this here. And if it doesn't do well, I wonder why it's not doing well. Let me try some things. Let me move it. Let me try it again next year. And that's where it sucks that our growing season is so short, because you don't get another opportunity at a lot of things, to me, for example. But I've talked to lots of friends and clients who are just getting started and basically said, observation is the first thing to do. Go out into your space and see where the sun is at various times of day. When it rains, see if the rain pools, see what the soil feels like. Like, what you're doing is really becoming acquainted with it. It's a relationship. And then you start to think about where you'll put a plant and what kind of plant you'll put there. And even then you keep observing, you go out and you just see it day to day.
Garden. So I was at a friend's yesterday whose garden really behaves almost like a bouquet. She has a lot of individual flowers interrelated in a way that at any given time, that snapshot has 5 or 6 different varieties right in that tiny little view. And then other people will do more bigger single chunks of things, kind of larger. Do you have an aesthetic that you think about with that?
I try to be a little bit flexible about like respecting different kinds of aesthetics, and you know, depending on what the client is interested, but also just that various things are inherently beautiful. But personally, in my own garden, it's more like a cottage style mess of different things that have self-sown, stuff coming up within other things. I don't like mulch. I like plants just live right up against each other and do their own mulching. And I like a certain wildness. I like to attract pollinators, of course, so I want it to be sort of swarming with life. And I actually have trouble restraining myself to a color palette. I like to just have it all there. But I have a house in South Troy with a postage stamp yard, so I'm really packing it all in, trying to make it feel like the country there.
Do you have a favorite go-to flower that wherever you've lived, you always want to see that come up in the season?
That's a great question. I think at different parts of the year, I would have an answer that is specific.
So right now, what is in your August garden that you have to have?
This year, what I'm really loving is Nicotiana. Do you know that flower? It's like, there's lots of varieties, but it's a relative of tobacco. And this year I planted the like species original native variety that hasn't been tampered with and beautified. And I didn't realize that it would be a 7-foot tall, like just behemoth of a plant. And I grew 100 seedlings of it. So there's 10 in my garden, and then the rest are in my flower production space. But they have these like fluted trumpet like white flowers, lots of them coming off the top. And I swear to God that in the evening they glow. That bright white in the garden this time of year with the sun setting pretty late is really, I think, very remarkable. But you know, the poppies just ended, and the poppies were amazing, and hydrangeas are just beginning to sort of pink up, and I love the like long panicle hydrangea. So because I've been doing this for a decade, it's easy for me to say like, oh, you can manage that, that's fine. The hyssop, you know, it's nice that it self-sows and it spreads out, but give me 5 more years and I might think that it's very annoying to be weeding out all these things that I intentionally planted at one point.
In your arrangements, do you have favorite flowers? Like what's behind you that you love today?
I've been using this pokeberry, which is just a full-on weed. It's like a roadside weed. It's you know, from nothing it emerges this monster. And this is just stuff that I already had in the studio today that I just made something quick from. But the pokeberry gives like a really nice structure, and it just volunteers. So I've been using it. And zinnias, of course, this time of year. Zinnias are just coming out of the ground in buckets. And I grew coreopsis for the first time this year. And amaranth, this like droopy, heavy amaranth. There's some wormwood that's like an invasive that I intentionally plant all the time.
I see that you're not afraid of green. You know, a lot of people want to focus on the stems and maybe not so much the green, but I can see how they really stand out more because they do have that beautiful green behind them. So
I like foliage so much that it would be very easy for me to just produce variegated foliage-based bouquets. And so I, particularly with weddings, I have a lot of clients who are interested in a mostly green palette. That's just something that I'm drawn to.
So it's funny how people think that they've got these formulas. Do you use any kind of formula when you put together a bouquet? Do you have a stunner or a center or a...
I really don't. And so it's gotten me into trouble because I teach workshops quite a bit. And so I've kind of had to back up and see if I can investigate my own process and make sense of it to describe it to someone else. But I also assisted some workshops and gleaned enough from those too to help articulate. Basically what I do is anything that has structure I start with. So I do this because if it's something that's branching, and that could be foliage, but it could also be a lilac or any flowering branch or a multi-stemmed zinnia. So it's just really about the architecture of the thing. That's how. And I've made bouquets that are just entirely blooms, and it's been very beautiful and lush. And then things that are entirely foliage. And I also think it's really beautiful to have a single variety. If you have a whole vase full of snapdragons or lilies or anything that is in its prime and fresh, it's very special. And there's an art to arranging just single varieties too, for sure.
I'm a big champion of the good old-fashioned hardworking zinnia. It's so funny how we can want all these great varieties and we seek them out. We go in the catalogs and we spend $18 per perennial, and that zinnia is just going to work all summer for you. And it's just going to say, clip me, I'll grow back, I'll grow back, I'll grow back. And they're just great little soldiers of the garden.
And there are lots of really good varieties. Like this year, this is my favorite this year. It's called Cinderella Lilac.
Oh.
And it's a cupcake variety. And as the fall goes on, they develop more and more stems that have double petals. And so they're like really rich, I think.
Do you trade flowers with other gardeners and things, or where do you get your starters?
I grow all of mine from seed inside under lights. And then just last year, I put up a small greenhouse so that I could finally have a place to move them outside when it's still cold out. And it's a very small, like hobby little redwood greenhouse that I love so much. And I buy seeds from all over. Yeah, and that's something that I feel like I say to new gardeners. I think people get really interested. It's such a nice thing to do in March and April to start seeds. But it's hard, and there's a specificity to it, and it's really disappointing when things don't grow the way you want. So that's a place where I feel like people can get really discouraged before it even gets warm enough to be outside. So I'm just like, buy seedlings.
You were talking about having gardens that you use for your business and that you have your home garden. Where are your garden lots?
One is just a block from my studio. We just moved studios and now I get to be very close to the garden. And that one I bought from the city of Troy in 2014 off the foreclosure list, which is a great resource. I mean, it's amazing that the city makes these lots available. So that lot is about 1/10 of an acre. And then I have another lot that's the same area right near my house in South Troy that I bought in 2018. And I'm still developing. So they both are the sites of former houses. So when you dig, it's just bricks and concrete and wrought iron and garbage. But it's a great space, you know, and having it in the city is really great.
Do people watch what you're doing and ask you questions and get engaged?
A little bit, yeah. It's to be honest, it's less of a community project than I sort of thought it would be in the beginning, because I'm behind a fence and folks are going about their business in the neighborhood. But now that the studio is closer to the garden, I feel a little bit more engaged. I'm here more and meeting more people in the neighborhood. This original garden on Jefferson Street is also in a neighborhood where a lot of people are moving in and out all the time. So I'm interested to see how being here in the studio will affect my presence.
Yeah. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Liz.
This is Colie Collen from Flower Scout, and you have our website, which is flowerscout.com.
Flower-scout.com.
Flower-scout, so people can find you, and your writing is there too?
Yeah, most of it's old at this point, but if they follow me on Instagram, there's little tidbits all the time.
And what's your Instagram?
Also Flower Scout.